Though I should say to our listeners right now that if you don't mind waiting in line for a bit and want to be sure to get the occasion or the opportunity to raise the question, you should be phoning in right now. 312-591-7200, the number, 312-591-7200. For our distant and overseas listeners listening on the Internet, the email address, extension 720 at WGNradio.com. Extension 720 as one word at WGNradio.com. Directly back to our conversation with Carolyn Glick after this.
Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
I must tell you, Carolyn, one of the most, to me, outrageous things that the Israeli government has ever done was done only quite recently, when they traded over 1,000 imprisoned terrorists for one soldier. Nice lad, though Private or Corporal Shalit may be. That is not statecraft. That's not proper military performance. It's nuts. It means you're encouraging people to go capture some more Israeli soldiers. And indeed, one Saudi prince offered, what, $1 million for any captured soldier they would turn into him.
Look, I agree with you, and I've written about that and other previous hostages for terrorist swaps that Israel has undertaken over the past decade or so since the withdrawal from Lebanon.
And I can't understand how a conservative government, the Likud government, could go along with that and sign off on it.
I think that it was a means of pandering to the public.
Well, I learned from you, from some columns that you've written, that there was a very probably heavily financed public relations campaign handled by some major PR firms in Israel to stir up public opinion and to keep it insistent, calling for this very deal.
Look, there is a huge problem in Israel where you have kind of a constant war between rationality and emotionalism on the part of the population. This happens in all countries, but in Israel it's particularly acute when it relates to captured Israeli soldiers, because Israel's army is a citizens' army. All young people at the age of 18, essentially as a rule, are conscripted into the IDF, boys for 3 years, girls for 2. And so it's very easy to manipulate public opinion, and terrorists do it all the time by kidnapping soldiers, because they could be anybody's child, and everybody feels emotionally extorted by the bid. And so manipulating, again, public opinion to make these kinds of totally irrational decisions that are dangerous for the public and, in fact, endanger other Israeli soldiers, because it encourages further abductions and hostages, and also enables the massacre of untold numbers of Israelis by the terrorists who are being freed. These kinds of swaps are able to happen because of the kind of emotional blackmail that they exert on the population as a whole.
Have any of these released terrorists shown up again, bomb in hand, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. We have data that indicate that in the swaps that have occurred just since 2004, over 300 Israelis have been murdered. Since 2000, over 300 Israelis were murdered directly by terrorists who were released from prison in the framework of terrorists for hostage swaps. And of course, the most famous, or the first time that Israel ever did something like this, was in 1986 in what was called the Jibril deal, which was with the arch-terrorist Ahmed Jibril, where in exchange for 6 Israeli prisoners of war from the Lebanon War, Israel released 1,500 terrorists. And the result of that was the first Palestinian uprising against Israel in 1988, and then it also instigated much of the later terrorism in the early 90s during the Oslo War. During the Oslo process were carried out by terrorists who had been released during that deal in 1986. So, we have a long history of knowing full well that these releases lead directly to the murder of Israeli civilians.
Well, there's an old adage in the Latin form, vox populi vox Dei est. The voice of the people is the voice of God, but a serious politician doesn't necessarily honor that at all costs.
Well, no, and certainly in Judaism there is a real a rejection of the notion that mankind can ever be divine. So that is certainly not a Jewish saying.
But it seems to have been the principle on which this Jewish government operated.
No, I think that
instance.
The government was operating on a populist, from a populist position. The media in Israel had been exerting so much pressure on the government to go ahead with this release that I think they finally decided, or Netanyahu decided, I think unwisely and irresponsibly, and in real dereliction of duty, to go along with this media circus.
Has there been any negative feedback that he's received and been chastened by, or?
Well, I mean,
or is the whole thing blown over now?
The Palestinian terrorists themselves are vowing to go back to the field and kill more Israelis. The people who were released have already pledged to do that, and they've been interviewed on television. They've been celebrated in Palestinian public schools as heroes, and all the children have been told that they should emulate their example, and so on and so forth. So, already the Palestinians are making clear that they're using this as a massive propaganda victory and also as an operational victory.
I got to shift quickly, time being short, does the so-called Arab Spring offer any hope at all for its bearing upon the situation of Israel?
Well, perhaps in the long run, because in the long run, if the forces of freedom that have been unleashed by the overthrow of tyrants in the Arab world ever enables the cultivation of democratic liberal norms of behavior and values in the Arab world, then that in the long run will in fact promote peace. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the populist forces that are most dominant not only in countries like Egypt, which border Israel, but also in further away countries like Libya and Tunisia, the populist forces in these areas are radical Islamic forces, anti-Western, anti-Semitic, misogynist forces, of reactionary forces that are now winning elections and are overthrowing governments, are likely to win the elections in Egypt that are going to begin next week. They won the elections in Tunisia, which was supposedly so secular. They've overthrown the Gaddafi regime in Libya and are forming a new government. So what we're seeing today
that new Libyan government has announced that the basis of law will be Sharia.
Right. And so, again, we're looking at a situation where the populist forces that have been unleashed by the overthrow of authoritarian leaders in the Arab world are all antithetical to Israel's interests, as well as to the interests of the United States and to the cause of human freedom in general.
Yet, you think that the Israeli public remains essentially optimistic about its future?
Israel has never really needed anybody's approval to do well, and Israelis really have never measured their lives by how well they're loved by their neighbors. And again, looking at what's happening inside of Israel, particularly from an economic perspective, things have never been better. So the situation on the ground with the Palestinians and with the wider Arab world and, of course, with Iran is quite dangerous. But Israel itself is succeeding phenomenally.
One large question on the horizon, and we've had a lot of journalistic speculation as to what the Israeli government will do and whether it will do it rather soon, is, of course, the prospect of a nuclear weapon developed by Iran and put on their already available missiles.
Look, Iran has made clear repeatedly that that the Iranian government seeks the annihilation of Israel, that it wants Israel to be wiped off the map, that it wants to see the extermination of the Jews in Israel. And Israel, of course, did not come into an existence, as Netanyahu made the point so eloquently in the Oval Office, that we didn't come back to the land of Israel in order to allow it to be destroyed. And so I think that the speculation is reasonable, because Israel is not going to allow an existential threat of nuclear annihilation to become a reality in Iran.
You've worked in the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. You retain the rank of captain, I guess, or are you higher now?
No, I'm captain.
Is it you probably don't have privileged information on this? All the same, does it seem likely to you that contingency plans have been very, very fully developed for an assault upon the Iranian nuclear sites.
Well, it would be a dereliction of duty of the Israeli government not to have such contingency plans at the ready.
What will set them into action?
I think that the government has been very clear that if the U.S. and the rest of the international community is unable or unwilling to do anything to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, then Israel is going to act on its own. And, the president even said in a speech before AIPAC in May that Israel has to have the ability to defend itself by itself from all threats. And so I think that Israel has developed those means and will use them if necessary.
We are going to pause right now for an update on the news and then directly to your questions and comments. For phone calls, the number 312-591-7200, 312-591-7200. And for email, and we encourage that as well, from wherever you are, particularly if you are an Internet listener on some other continent or way up north or way down south, get to us via email. The email address, extension 720 at WGNradio.com. Extension 720 as one word at WGNradio.com. And we look forward to your contributions. Get them in right now. We'll be with you after the update on the news from Paula Cooper.
Milt Rosenberg and Extension 720 on 720 WGN.
And directly back to Carolyn Glick, who is these days the deputy managing editor of the Jerusalem Post. Her columns can be seen twice a week. What days do they ordinarily appear, by the way?
Tuesday and Friday.
And, of course, they're all available on the Internet in large number. And they get an awful lot of commentary as well. It's a major education as to what the state of knowledge and confusion is concerning Israel and its situation when one reads the commentary by the readers. And the columns by you are always informative and usually, to me, very persuasive. 312-591-7200 is the number. If you've been trying to reach us, try again quickly. We've got a few lines cleared, and they were not cleared a few minutes ago. Not everybody makes the cut, but pose your question intelligently, and you probably will. And we go directly to the first caller. David has joined us. Good evening.
Hi. I have enjoyed Carolyn's editorials for a couple of years now, and I wish I could meet her someday. But in any case, I have two questions. Either one I would be pleased to hear her answer. The first one is, how does Carolyn account for the virulent hatred and violence against the Jewish people for the last 2 millennia? And then secondly, why do you think the United States is so stubborn about releasing Jonathan Pollard from an American prison when he's already served such a long term and died while his father was in prison and so forth? What is behind such determination to keep him imprisoned?
I think that in answer to your first question, I think actually the Weekly Standard last week, I believe, published an article by Harvard professor Ruth Weiss where she talked about the distinction between Jew hatred and other forms of prejudice that we've seen over human history, and really showed that the thing about hating Jews that's different from hating ethnic minorities or other religious minorities is that anti-Semitism is really a political cause. It's not simply antipathy towards a certain type of people. That really you find that anti-Semites are able to use their hatred of Jews as a way to mobilize populations to follow certain leaders. And this has been true really across history, that Jews have been victimized and scapegoated and cast out of general society as a means of organizing political forces inside of society. And this is something that we really haven't seen so much with other types of prejudices, and that's why it's so unique. And that's also why it's so it always manages to regenerate itself, because somebody always has something to gain from a power perspective by hating Jews and by promoting the hatred of the Jewish people.